And we are live. So today's episode is called The Middle Matters, giving middle managers the tools to be successful. And we have our guest this week is our very own Jeff Sigel, the now author of, and I got to figure out how the camera works, The Middle Matters. Oh, there's Elena's
fireworks. Here are my fireworks for Jeff.
Here's Jeff's book. And Jeff, as you know, the question we always pose to our guests is, what is on your mind?
Well, Eric, before I jump in and answer that question, I just wonder, is like being a guest on your own podcast like being a guest in your own home? I don't know. Anyway, so
but we'll have to see how we treat you, I guess.
All right, yeah. So anyway, so actually, obviously, I have been thinking a lot about middle management because I've been writing this book and working on this book and editing this book and trying to market this book for many, many months now. And one of the topics that I think is really interesting that I often find is like a really important topic is this matter of one-on-one meetings. I often, when I'm in front of groups of middle managers and so forth, I often say, if you take nothing away from this presentation, it's that your one-on-one meeting is the most important meeting that you have every week. And I find that almost every time I say that, people are like, get really uncomfortable because a lot of people don't meet with their own people. So it's just an interesting thing that that's been on my mind as I think about middle managers a lot recently. So.
Interesting. So let me ask you a question. Like, why did you decide to write a book? I mean, we all kind of, at times in our career when things get real weird, roll our eyes at, God, you got to write a book about it, right? But nobody ever does. You actually did it. Not only that, but some of your own peculiar stories made it into the book.
Absolutely.
So, like, what was that tipping point that you said, you know what, I'm going to do it?
All right. So there's a couple of parts to the answer to this question. The first part is that during the pandemic, when everyone else was quilting and making sourdough, I decided that I wanted to start writing. And I actually wrote a couple of novels that I have not published, but Eric has read. Eric's like, I don't know if he's my biggest fan, but he definitely gets to read a lot of my stuff.
You get to read all your books.
You get to read all my books.
And actually, I've read this book
multiple
times, cover to cover, and one time when I was going through helping you with the final editing. So.
And I appreciate it, but so to that point, like I started writing, and I realized I really liked writing, and I started also around maybe 2 years ago, I discovered this magazine, a literary magazine called Elegant Literature, where they give you a prompt every month, and you can write a story for 2,000 words or less every month, and then the next month you get to see whether your story got published. And I've gotten one story published and a couple stories that got sort of honorable mentions and so forth. And so writing stories and telling stories is something that I've just really come to enjoy doing. So that was part one of the story. The second piece of the story was that when I was at Cracker Barrel in my last corporate job, I was sort of like one of the go-to non-HR people to do presentations to middle managers. And so I was giving presentations to folks, in middle management roles about things like how to use strategy in your day-to-day work or how to build trust with your team. And I really liked this topic of helping middle managers sort of find their way. And that was actually, it was those presentations where I was like finding out, people aren't necessarily doing those one-on-ones that I'm talking about. and so forth. And so there's little things like that, like how do you have a good one-on-one? How do you manage up to your boss? What if your boss is a micromanager? All these things that were sort of bubbling up and coming up that I just found really interesting. And then the next thing that happened was I decided to leave my corporate job in October. And I am, Eric will vouch for this. I just can't stop doing stuff. And so I was leaving my job. I had time on my hands, and I just was like, that literally the day after, my last day of job, I'm like, I'm going to write a book. I'm going to write a book about this.
The one thing I would just say, Jeff, is your process of writing this book. It was like 6 weeks from when you quit your job, you had finished the first version of it. And now it's like 6 months later, but that's just all of the editing and the process of it that's happened. So yeah, you were very much on top of it. It was like, was it like a catharsis?
I have to ask this. Did you actually like write it, or you did dictation and speech to text and no? You actually
that's actually an interesting question. So the first novel that I wrote during the pandemic, I actually wrote out longhand on. I think I ended up with something like 7 or 8 full notepads of just stuff, and so I wrote out. Actually, to say I wrote it out longhand is a little bit of a not quite right. I wrote out like a lot, and then I typed it all in. And so the second time I tried to write a novel, I was like, I'm never doing that again, because it's just too painful to have to write all of the, all of these things out by hand and then have to write them again. Sorry, I'm closing my window because there's like motorcycle. Anyway.
Which is funny because you live in a cul-de-sac.
I know, it's very weird.
They all came to celebrate your book.
They're all exactly. Maybe it was those fireworks before. But anyway, so that was how I wrote the first one. The second one I actually tried. I'm just going to write it directly onto type it directly on the computer. And so I think what I did with this one was I had this structure in mind of how I wanted to structure the book. And so I hand wrote an outline and sort of had all the stories laid out. I knew exactly what stories went with which sections or whatever, and then typed the whole thing in directly. So that's how I did it. And then to Eric's point, I actually was writing, I had a goal that I had to write 1,000 words a day, every day, including weekends. And that's why, a business book is about, 35 to 55,000 words typically. And so it only took me, 35 to 45 days or something. And I had a whole book.
So Jeff, you mentioned structure, like that you came up with the structure at first. And I think you've come up with this formulation for what the middle manager does, these 3 different roles. And I think people maybe inherently kind of intuit that there are these roles, but I don't think I've ever seen anybody put it quite in that context. And so can you talk a little bit? Well, first of all, maybe present what that structure is, and then maybe talk about what made how'd you come up with that approach?
Yeah. So the structure that you're talking about was this idea that a middle manager has 3 distinct roles that they are playing at all times. They are playing a role with respect to their own manager, which I call doer, right? They have work that they need to get done, things that they need to accomplish, etc. So that's the doer role. Then you have the second role, which is a role they have with respect to the people that report to them, which is, in the book I call the leader role, right? And then the third role is the role that they have with respect to their peers. And how do you get the people that don't report to you or you don't report to, so they have no stake in anything that you're trying to accomplish? How do you get them to do that, the work that you need them to do to make your ideas and so forth come to life? And that role I call the influencer role. And for me, it was, I think as I was teaching these courses and getting, and being asked to, give presentations and so forth, what I was finding was that most people get promoted to middle management roles because they are good at doing something. They are good at doing finance, they are good at doing accounting, they're good at doing marketing, they're good at what any number, they're good at be doing data analytics, or whatever it is they're good at. And then what happens is they get promoted, and and because they're good at doing it, and the assumption is that they are going to just be great at leading other people doing the thing that they were doing before. And what I think is sort of that's sort of almost a ridiculous idea, that you spend all these years to become an accountant or a lawyer or a doctor, and then suddenly you're going to be able to lead other people, as if leading was just sort of this afterthought, or that you're going to be great at influencing your peers and sort of understanding the politics and whatever, and you're going to do all that without having any kind of training or understanding of how to do these things. And so for me, it was really about what are the parts of the middle manager role that people just have a really hard time doing, because nobody ever spent any time training them how to do it. And so that's
it's very interesting that you bring it up, because I never really thought about it that way until I started reading your book, but it's very, very true. Right? You get into it, and you're lucky if there is a corporate training 6 months later or a year later, and you just have to bridge till then. But you may be not so lucky because your company may not have training or something else. And in some cases, there is really nothing. And the system just assumes that you're going to gather that knowledge. And the interesting thing is that as a doer, in essence, you can screw up less, because your area of, potential impact is smaller, right? Then you're rising through the ranks. You have 10 people reporting to you. You can screw up tenfold by being a bad manager.
Yeah.
But somehow it doesn't occur to anybody. It sure didn't occur to me that there's like this really large gap in how the business entities approach raising leaders or not raising leaders.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that it's really interesting, because what I've found is, and certainly, Elena, you and I probably both took this class at Nabisco, like whenever, we won't say how many years ago, but it used to be that when you became a people leader for the first time at Nabisco, you went to this leadership training course. And I actually remember something from this leadership training course. So it's not like it was a complete loss, but what I find is, there's this idea in terms of how people learn, that you have to be educated or trained, right? And then you actually have to apply the learning. But probably even more important is that you then have to reinforce that learning. And what happens typically, and I've actually had a lot of conversations with HR leaders who have told me that this is the case, is there's so many middle leaders in a big company. There could be thousands of middle leaders.
It's just about everybody.
Yeah, it's just about everybody that isn't like...
Yes, in the entry level.
And actually almost everybody, and at least in my experience, the ambition of people, almost everybody wants to be promoted into that leadership role at some point in their career.
So you have all these people, and the issue for big companies is that they don't want to spend the money. It's just too expensive to train all those people. So what they do is they basically say, well, we have whatever, $2 million. We will do one training a year or something like that, or we'll just train the new people, or we'll only train a high potential people because that's all we can afford. And everybody else will just kind of figure it out. And it's kind of it's a little bit of a crazy idea if you think about it, because to your point, Elena, is I've got somebody in charge of, like, let's say 5 people, 10 people, whatever it is. And that person, if they don't do their job well, is going to diminish the capacity of the whole team. All those 10 people now may be accomplishing what 3 people could be doing, because the leader is not leveraging those people in the way they can? Or can you, if you train a leader, you might be able to get a lot more out of these people. And then the other thing that I find happens in the corporate world is, so we don't train the people, and then they don't seem to be super effective at getting the most out of the team. And so then what we say is, well, the middle leaders don't really do anything. And so there's these cycles. It seems like, I don't know, maybe every 5 to 10 years or whatever, where you start seeing these articles. I just saw one that somebody just sent me one about a week ago called The Great Unbossing, and it's all where they're like, we're going to fire the middle people because we don't need them because they don't really do anything, and we'd be better off just having all the individual contributors, report into a VP or whatever. And it fundamentally doesn't work, because that person at this higher level doesn't have the time or the sort of recency of having done those jobs or whatever to help those people. But even more important is then there's nobody in between. And so,
well, and then also another thing is, did that person, it's also a middle manager, did that person get trained, or would it be a 100-fold, a disaster?
Yeah. No,
so there's a situation that you've talked about a few times in the last several months as you've been doing this, as you've been doing trainings with people, as you've been doing presentations, is the concept of people mistaking leader problems and doer problems. And that one has stuck with me as being a really interesting thing. Can you explain that? And obviously, tell us your thoughts about what it is and why it is that people get that one wrong.
Yeah, so it's really interesting. So one of the first things when I've trained folks on the stuff that's in the book is that I tell them about this doer, leader, influencer sort of 3-role idea. And then I ask them about problems that they're facing in their day-to-day work. And I ask them to classify, like, is that a doer problem, a leader problem, or an influencer problem? And so let's take the classic problem. The classic doer problem is, I have a micromanaging boss, right? Because there's just a lot of micromanagers out there or whatever, unfortunately, not necessarily maliciously, but they're out there. And so these people have micromanaging bosses, and it's very frustrating because they feel like their boss doesn't trust them and so forth. And so I'll ask them what kind of problem they have, and they will say, I have a leader problem. And the reason they say I have a leader problem is because my leader is micromanaging me. But my whole point, and the whole point in the book, is not about, hey, I'm going to whine and complain about all the terrible bosses I've had over the course of my career. The whole point of the book was to say, okay, so you have a boss that probably should be doing something differently, or they aren't well trained or whatever. I'm not going to tell you about what it should be like or what your boss might be doing or whatever, because it's very difficult to suggest that you're going to somehow get your boss to act any differently. Let's focus on what you can do in your role to make to make things better and to improve things and whatever. How do you basically take ownership of the problem? And so if the problem is your boss is a micromanager or whatever, your problem is a doer problem. Their problem may be a leader problem, but your problem is a doer problem. And so that's what I mean. That's what you're talking about, is this idea of people get confused about what's a doer problem, what's a leader problem, what's an influencer problem, because they are thinking about the problem as everyone else. But the solution, unfortunately, or fortunately, I don't know, whatever, but the solution is always, what are you going to do about it, right?
Yeah. It definitely should be owned. But guess what? The time had come for the silly ChatGPT questions. And today I am going to
actually, this is like just rewards or something, because I think
exactly it's a payback. It's a payback, because Jeff is going to answer the stupid ChatGPT questions, and I'm not going to let him select what type he wants. I just pulled 10, so I'm going to Pick
All
one
right.
right there. This is a good one. If your book were to be turned into a blockbuster movie, who would play you and what genre would the book be? Action, comedy, or sci-fi?
So I'm going to say for the first one, I actually have an answer for because I don't know whether this is true, but my wife always tells me I look like Nicolas Cage. So we're going to go with Nicolas
Okay,
Cage.
then. So I guess we shall be writing to Nicolas Cage that there is a,
Well, who's gonna play me? He doesn't even have a twin brother.
oh, come on,
Oh, come
AI,
on, man.
we can clone
Yeah,
Nicolas
that's true.
Cage.
Do
What
multiple.
if I don't want to be like
Yeah.
Nicolas Cage?
Actually, Amy said that you don't look like Nicolas Cage at all.
Okay, that's good to know.
And then, but your question of what type of movie would it be? I think, I mean, it's a comedy. I mean, absolutely. I mean,
I have to say, some of the stories read pretty comedic, sad and funny way. All right, so there is another.
Well, it's also though laughable how messed up some of this this corporate, like you almost have to make it a comedy because this is it's actually probably more of a tragedy, but you just couldn't watch it.
So there is another one. Listen, this one. If you could recruit any fictional character to join your leadership team, who would it be and why?
Oh, I mean, you guys aren't going to be super surprised when I say this. I'm like completely obsessed with Ted Lasso right now.
He's not fictional. You
Ted-
got to pick a fictional character.
No, Ted Lasso's fictional. Ted Lasso's fictional.
You have to be a book. I mean, he's a.
Okay.
I mean, do you want me to go a little? Do you want me to go?
No, that's fine. That's fine. If that's your pick, so there's easy answers.
It's funny that you're like such a big fan of Ted Lasso because I think when I told you to watch it, like was only like 2 or 3 weeks ago or something.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I'm like I am a convert. I'm a convert.
Okay.
I mean, Ted Lasso is what I think is amazing about Ted Lasso as a character is that his leadership style is very much based on a very different leadership model, right? His leadership style is all about, how do I grow the team? How do I do the things that I need to do day in, day out to get better and better as a team, as opposed to this sort of like just do it better kind of approach that I feel like I've seen a lot in my career. Surprisingly often in my career, I've seen from either people around me or from my bosses, maybe I've done it too, is this sort of like this belief that your team just needs to do it right. And if they aren't doing it right, then they just tell them to do it again. And this is something I actually in the book I refer to this approach to leadership as green eggs and ham, right? This idea that when you go to your leader and you ask your leader, or you say, here's this presentation I put together or whatever, and they say no, that's not right, and they send you back and you're supposed to come back with something better, and you're sitting there going, well, I didn't just produce some crappy presentation. I produced what I thought was right, so how do I make it better without any feedback, without any input or whatever? And so it's just a little bit like green eggs and ham. You ask your boss, do you like it on a train? And they say no. And you like it on a plane? They say no, right? And I'm not making any progress. I can't learn because I'm not getting any feedback. I don't know how to amplify the things I'm doing right. I don't know how to eliminate the things that I'm not doing right. And what I loved about, sort of the Ted Lasso method was he basically was like, I'm not interested in the results, the game, the whatever it is, the specific thing that's facing us in the moment is how do we just focus on learning and getting better and saying, hey, you could have done, here's how you might next time think about this differently and so forth. So anyway, that's my
next question for you, Jeff, because we talked a fair amount about the this common problem of micromanagement. Mm-hmm. So I don't think we actually got to what's what's the one or two things you would say if you have a micromanager? What do you tell people to do?
Yeah, so it's really interesting. I think so many times the answer to a problem is completely counterintuitive. You have to sort of do the opposite thing that's your initial emotional reaction to it is. So the initial emotional reaction to somebody who's micromanaging you is to get really frustrated. Why don't they trust me? And so one of the things I talk about in the book is that the doer role is all about building credibility. And the relationship with your boss is almost all the problems that you have with your boss are almost always boiled down to some form of a credibility problem. And in the micromanager case, it's that your boss typically is feeling insecure about themselves as a doer. And so they are worried that they are not going to live up to their own boss's expectations. And so therefore they're worried that anything they delegate to you is not going to be up to the level that it needs to be so that they don't get themselves in trouble. And so basically the credibility issue is they don't trust that the team, you, whatever, are going to produce the work that needs to get produced. And so that's why I say it's a credibility problem. And what I often tell the people who are running into these credibility problems with the micromanager and so forth is just because your boss doesn't trust you does not mean that you are not trustworthy. So that's the first thing, is get past the emotion of this is about your boss feeling insecure, not about you doing bad work. So that's the first thing. The second thing I tell people when they're running into micromanager situations is that in some ways the best thing to do is essentially to now drown your boss in the details. So basically they don't trust that you're getting things right or whatever, then over communicate, tell them even more what you're doing, send them a note every Friday morning. Here's all the things I'm working on. Just keep feeding them the details, and eventually and do the things that they're asking you to do. And eventually what will happen is they will eventually get to the point where they go, okay, enough. Like, I trust you. You can do this. You don't have to keep giving this information. And I say that in the book, but I also would say that if you go into Stephen Covey's 7 Habits, he talks about the exact same thing. There's this great story in the 7 Habits where he talks about a manager or a chief executive officer who's essentially micromanaging all his people. Everybody's frustrated, and the one guy who basically says, I'm just going to do all the stuff that's asked of me, is the one that essentially finally gets to level up and get to the next level of the game. Because at some point the boss says, I know when I give it to Joe or whatever, that Joe will always get done what I need to get done. So it's super counterintuitive, because you're so frustrated with this idea that your boss doesn't trust you and so forth. You're like, they should just trust me. But they don't trust you, so you have to basically figure out how you're going to build credibility. And this is why, Eric, I know you've heard me say this, that I believe that probably the most dangerous word in the English language is the word should.
Yeah, and I independently came to that concept when I was managing my team a couple of jobs ago, and I would say like should is a 4-letter word. It's like, who cares what you should do?
Right.
So what you're saying is very true in very objective circumstances, right?
Mm-hmm.
You're told what to do. You don't like what you're told, but the best way to do it is you just do it until you prove to your boss that I actually do what I'm told and I do a good job. So that's it, right? Very objective. There is another side to this coin, is that your boss is a micromanager because they are scared, frightened, political reasons. And it's interesting that actually your book embraces politics and looks at politics as part of your job. So there is another angle to it, right? So what do you do then?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I think that to your point, Elena, is politics is this sort of dirty word in business. People are like, oh, I don't like politics, especially junior folks. Like, politics is bad and like it's whatever. But the reality, my joke that I like to say about this is there's probably been politics going on in human interactions since people were trying to see how they could get the choicest parts of the woolly mammoth. Like you can't, you there's always politics. There's always somebody who is trying to get an angle, get something better, get something worse, or whatever. And so it's not about whether politics are good or bad. They just are something that you have to deal with. And so a lot of the politics, so the first rule I have of politics is to recognize that the other person or the other people that you are dealing with all believe that they are the hero of their own story. We are all living in a movie in which we are Nicolas Cage, right? I mean, we are all the hero.
I'm not Nicolas Cage.
Or
I'm
Eric, somebody else.
Virtual Nicolas Cage.
But I'm Nicolas Cage. But everybody's the hero of their own story, and so a lot of times it's a matter of like, how do you put yourself in the how do you put yourself in the other person's shoes and think about what they are looking for and so forth, and then align what it is that you need from them to what they are looking for or what they're trying to accomplish, and that helps you get things done. And so I think the answer, Elena, to your question is how, with your boss, who is, sort of in this political nightmare situation, whatever it is, you have to first put yourself in your boss's shoes and say, what's going on with them? What are they worried about? Whatever. They're worried that their peers are going to not do the thing that they need them to do, or they're worried that somebody else is going to get promoted over them, or whatever it is. And so your job then, I always like to say, when you start to think about somebody else being the hero of their own story, the question becomes, what role are you going to play? Because there's really only two. You can either be a supporting character or you can be a villain. Mm-hmm. And so when your boss is struggling, how can you be a supporting character? How can you help them create better connections? How do you for example, if my boss is trying to get something done and I know that somebody in a different department, another leader in a different department, is going to be trying to block my boss from getting done this thing that we need to get done as a team, what I might sometimes do is basically go to the people at my level over in that other department and say, hey, I wanted to tell you about this thing. This is why it's really great for your team or whatever, so that I can get, not only is my boss now talking to their peer, but my boss is now but my boss's peer is now hearing from their own people, hey, the guys over marketing are trying to do X, Y, and Z, and we think it's really great because it's going to be great for us, right? So how do you help your boss sort of sell something in by essentially getting more people at different levels supporting the thing that he needs? And making sure that the people that are sort of on the other side of that equation are understanding what.
As it always happens with our episodes, is they fly by. But one thing I want to ask right before we do our go around, particularly since we have an extra slot that we aren't going to use, is how do you feel about the fact that you are now legit on Amazon?
What, Eric?
That is the legit screen capture of the Amazon page for Jeff's book.
It's really cool. I took on writing a book. I mean, obviously I like to write, and I would love to have as many people as possible read this book, because I really do feel like there's some value there. And one of the real values I think that's in there is I actually am not talking about stories where I won the day and never made any mistakes or whatever. There's a lot of stories in this book where I made mistakes, and I think that it's really valuable. I think it would have been really valuable for me to hear, like, what are some of the mistakes other people have made? How did people get it wrong? So, but it's really exciting for me, because it was really about a learning experience. I wanted to go through the process of writing a book and not just writing the book and then sort of going, I don't know what to do with this novel or whatever, but like, well, what does it take to actually publish it? What does it take to market it and whatever? And so we'll see how the book does in the world. But for me, the real exciting, sort of value of this and success of it was just doing it, going through the process, putting a book out there. And I posted about this the other day on LinkedIn. I had a friend in college who said to me, "You're going to write a book someday." And so it's literally been on my list ever since. I was like, I don't know what I'm going to write a book about, but whatever. And so it's just
Well,
exciting.
I said to you a couple months ago, you're going to have a podcast someday. And so my question, Jeff, is given that we usually rely on you to say, before I go into my one thing, how do we get in touch with you? I guess it's on me to say, Jeff, before we go into our one things, how do we get in touch with you?
Well, so the first thing I would say is, I think the best place to go if somebody's watching this and is interested in the book and whatever is go to my author site, which is jeffsigel.com. And you can find there, all the usual stuff, my bio or whatever. But if you go on there, there's a page that you can go onto the book page, and actually on the book page is this really cool preview of the book. There's a flip book. You can kind of flip through, see some of the reviews that I've already gotten, and so forth. But it's sort of a fun way to sort of get a sense of the book before you buy the book. And then, of course, you can reach me through probably the best way to reach me actually these days is on LinkedIn. I'm on LinkedIn all the time. And so please connect with me. I have a newsletter called the Middle Management Matters that I post articles every week about middle management things and so forth. So, but that's where the best place to sort of start, reach out to me, direct message me, etc. That's probably the best way to get me.
So, because I don't want people to think we're playing favorites, when we go around and do your one thing, Jeff, you get to go first and you don't get to think about it. So go.
Well, so I guess for me, the one thing I would say is just how much I've been appreciative of the both of you and having me and giving me an opportunity to talk about this cool book. We are celebrating today because I don't know if everybody can see this, but Eric just got us. Oops, I gotta get in front of my camera. Eric just got us Twinning Strategy mugs, and one's on the way to Elena right now. But Eric and I are drinking out of our Twinning Strategy mugs. But seriously, for me, I think the big takeaway is I think middle managers have the ability and the possibility of being the most impactful people in any organization, and so I think learning how to do all these roles is of the middle manager is really the huge opportunity. I will pass it over to Elena.
So a couple of things. Number one, it's how nice it is to see somebody really realize their lifelong bucket list doing by writing a book. Not only did he do that, but think about it, that journal that only published you once for contributing every week, forget that. Establish your own weekly newsletter and publish yourself every week on LinkedIn, right? It's all about taking ownership of what you want to get to, as it talks about in the book, about taking ownership of how you manage your relationships as a doer and influencer and leader. So here we go.
Awesome. Thank you.
And so my one thing is I really like this framework that you set up, this 3-role framework, the doer, leader, influencer. It's something that definitely ever since you've formulated that way has been on my mind. And, just from watching you up close, writing this book, reading it in different formats as it got, more and more refined, et cetera. It's just been really cool to watch that. So, one more plug for your book. Here's an image of the real of the cover. By the way, the cover is it Faye Amarante? Is that it?
Yeah, Faye. Yeah,
Amarante is a former colleague of Jeff's and has created this incredible art. And actually, there's a video of her drawing it live that Jeff's posted on or Painting It Live. It's just a really cool cover and a really great book. And I know it sounds biased, but I promise you that sometimes siblings don't actually follow through and support their siblings because they're like, oh, it's great effort, but this is not the case. This is a fantastic book. I wish I had this book back when I was starting out as middle manager, and still learning from it now, even though this is I'm on my third pass through it. So thank you so much, Elena and Jeff. This has been a fantastic, extra long special episode. We look forward to catching up the next time. Are we skipping next week, or is
it next week for the 4th of July? So we'll be back on in 2 weeks.
Awesome. Cool. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.